The envelope sat on my kitchen table for 3 days before I opened it. I knew what it was. My son had mentioned the graduation ceremony was in June, back when things between us still felt normal. Back when I could call him on a Tuesday night just to check in and he'd actually pick up. That was before Courtney's mother decided I was a problem that needed managing. I'm a pipefitter. Have been for 31 years. I worked for a union contractor out of Sudbury. Spent most of my career on industrial sites up north. Paper mills, mining operations. The kind of work that keeps the lights on across this province but doesn't exactly get you invited to garden parties. My hands are rough. My truck is a 2009 F-150 with a crack across the dashboard that I've been meaning to fix since Harper was in office. I don't own a blazer that fits properly and I've never pretended otherwise. My son, Declan, is different. Not in a bad way. I raised him to work hard and he did, just in a direction I hadn't expected. Scholarships, university, then a graduate program in business at Western. I drove him to London myself, helped carry boxes up 4 flights of stairs, ate a Subway sandwich in the parking lot afterward, and cried the whole way back up the 400. Proud doesn't cover it. He met Courtney in his 2nd year. She's from Oakville. Her father runs some kind of commercial real estate firm, and her mother, Diane, I'll get to her, volunteers on hospital boards and chairs charity galas, and has the kind of schedule that requires an actual assistant to manage. Nice people, I thought, when I first met them at a parents' weekend dinner. Polite. The kind of polite that takes practice. The envelope was a graduation announcement, not an invitation. That distinction took me a moment to understand. It had a little card inside that said the ceremony details would be shared closer to the date, and that they were keeping the celebration intimate. Declan's handwriting on the outside. Not a phone call. Not even a text first. An envelope. I set it on the counter and made myself a coffee, and stood at the window looking out at the backyard, at the woodpile I'd been stacking since October, and I thought, something is wrong here, and you already know what it is. I called him, that night, he answered, which surprised me a little. The call had that particular quality where you can feel the other person choosing their words, before they speak them, like they've rehearsed. Dad, hey bud, got your envelope. Pause. Yeah, so. The graduation thing, it's going to be pretty small. Courtney's family is organizing the dinner after, and they've kind of got a set number of seats at the restaurant, and Declan. It's nothing personal, Dad, it's just logistics. I let that sit for a second. Logistics. My son used the word logistics to explain why I wasn't invited to watch him walk across a stage and receive the degree I'd helped pay for. I co-signed his second student loan, $48,000, when his scholarship didn't cover the full tuition. Logistics. Is this coming from you, I said, or from somewhere else? He went quiet. That quiet told me everything. Dad, Diane just thinks the restaurant they've booked is really upscale, and she's worried about it's just a vibe thing, she said, about the group dynamic. The group dynamic. I'm 61 years old. I have been called a lot of things on a lot of job sites by a lot of people who were having bad days, and I have never once felt as small as I did standing in my own kitchen in Sudbury, Ontario, hearing my son tell me I was a liability to the group dynamic at his graduation dinner. Okay, I said. Dad, no, I heard you, it's okay. It wasn't okay, but I wasn't going to beg. I was raised by a man who said that dignity was the one thing nobody could take from you unless you handed it over yourself. My father was a miner. His hands made mine look soft, and he never once missed a single moment that mattered to his kids. Not one. I hung up and sat down at the kitchen table and didn't move for a long time. The thing about being a tradesman is that people have a specific idea of what you are before you open your mouth. They see the calluses and the coffee thermos and the truck, with the toolbox in the bed, and they make a calculation. Diane had done that calculation the first time she met me, at Thanksgiving 2 years earlier, when Declan and Courtney announced they were serious. I'd brought a bottle of Ontario Red, a Trius, not cheap, and she'd thanked me with the exact smile a person uses when they're accepting something they intend to set aside later. Her husband, whose name is Jeffrey, shook my hand and asked what I did, and when I told him, he said, "Oh, skilled trades, that's so essential," in the same tone people use when they tell you your mediocre casserole was so filling. I'm not a man who holds grudges easily. I believe most people are doing their best within whatever limitations they carry. But I knew, standing in Diane's foyer that Thanksgiving, that she had already decided what I was worth. The months that followed were quiet in the way that bad things are quiet before they get loud. Declan called less. When he did, he sounded managed. like he was reporting in rather than talking to his father. Courtney was always nearby. I could hear her in the background, not saying anything, just present. I started to understand that my son had fallen in love with a woman whose mother had decided to be the gravity in that relationship, and that Courtney either didn't see it or didn't have the footing yet to push back. I don't blame Courtney. I want to be clear about that. She's a young woman who grew up in a house where her mother was the center of everything, and that kind of upbringing leaves a particular shape on a person. She was kind to Declan. I believed she loved him. What I didn't believe was that she was running her own life. June came. I knew the date of the ceremony. I'd looked it up online. Western's convocation schedule is posted publicly. I did not go. I thought about going and standing outside just to see him walk in. I thought about it for 2 weeks. I decided not to. Not because I was angry. Because I wasn't going to make his day harder than it already was. And because some part of me hoped that not causing a scene might be the thing that eventually cost Diane her narrative. If I caused trouble, I was the problem. If I stayed home quietly, I was just a father who'd been kept away from his kid's graduation. I stayed home. I ate a frozen shepherd's pie and watched the hockey game and texted Declan at 8 o'clock. Proud of you, bud. Always. He sent back a thumbs up emoji, just the thumbs up. After 31 years of raising him, I didn't cry that night. I'd already done my crying. What I did do was write a letter. Not to Declan, not yet. To myself, really. Or maybe to the version of Declan I was going to need to be patient for. I wrote down everything I wanted to say and everything I was choosing not to say yet, and I put it in a drawer in my bedroom and I went to bed. The next several months were the loneliest of my adult life, and I say that as a man who was widowed at 44. My wife, Declan's mother, Sandra, died of ovarian cancer when Declan was 12. I held that family together with 2 hands and a prayer for the next 9 years until he left for school. I know what lonely is. That winter after his graduation had a different quality to it. Not grief, exactly, but something like being erased. Like someone had decided I was inconvenient to the story being told about my son's life. I kept working. I kept stacking the woodpile. I called my brother in Timmins on Sunday nights and didn't tell him most of what was happening, because I didn't want to turn it into a thing. I waited. The call I didn't expect came on a Thursday afternoon in March. I was on a lunch break, sitting in my truck outside a treatment plant north of the city, and the number that came up on my phone was one I didn't recognize, a 905 area code, which is the GTA. Is this Gord? Gord McRae? It is. My name is Elliot Farnsworth. I believe our kids are engaged to be married. I sat up straight in my seat. Courtney's father. Jeffrey, except the name wasn't Jeffrey, or maybe Jeffrey was a middle name or a nickname. I didn't know. I didn't know much about this man except that he'd stood in his foyer 2 Thanksgivings ago and shaken my hand, and then apparently gone along with whatever his wife decided. Mr. Farnsworth, I said. This is a surprise. I imagine it is. He paused, and his voice had a quality I recognized. The careful, measured tone of a man who is choosing to say something he's been talking himself out of for a while. I owe you an apology for the graduation. That was wrong. I didn't handle it well and I should have. I didn't say anything for a moment. I watched a raven land on the fence across the road and tilt its head at my truck. I appreciate that, I said. Declan and Courtney are planning a wedding. May long weekend, a venue up near Collingwood. And I need to tell you that what happened at graduation is not going to happen again. I've made that clear to my wife. Made it clear how, another pause. Longer this time. I told her that if you weren't at the wedding, I wouldn't be either. And that if she wanted to argue about it, she could do that with our son-in-law at the rehearsal dinner. I put my hand over my mouth for a second, not because I was going to cry, although my eyes were doing something my eyes don't do very often, but because I needed a moment to understand what was happening. This man who I had written off as a soft participant in his wife's project had apparently drawn a line. For me, a man he barely knew. Why, I asked. Not accusatory, genuinely asking. He was quiet again, and when he spoke his voice was different. Not the careful boardroom voice, but something underneath it. I grew up in Burlington, he said. My dad was a machinist at a manufacturing plant off Fairview. He worked there for 38 years. My mother's family was from money, and they spent my entire childhood letting my father know it in small ways. Every Christmas dinner, every milestone, the way they'd compliment him on what good value he was. His voice went flat on those last 2 words, in a way that told me he'd been carrying them for decades. I swore when I was about 17 years old that I would never be the person who made a working man feel small in his own family. And then I stood in my own house and let that happen, and I've been ashamed of it ever since. I didn't have an answer for that. I just sat there in my truck while the Raven flew off, and I thought about how people carry things, and how sometimes it takes a long time for what a person really is to surface past everything that's accumulated on top of it. I'd like to meet properly, Elliot said, before the wedding. If you're willing, I'm willing, I said. We met at a diner in Barrie the following Saturday, neutral ground, more or less equidistant between Sudbury and Oakville. He drove up in a German sedan, and I pulled in next to him in my cracked Davbird F-150, and we both got out and looked at each other for a second. And then he put out his hand and I shook it, and this time it meant something. We talked for 3 hours. We talked about our kids and our wives, his still living, mine not, and about the particular challenge of watching your children build lives that don't look like the lives you built, and about what you hold on to and what you let go of and how you decide which is which. He told me about the early years of his business, when he was doing commercial property work, out of a rented office above a dry cleaner on Plains Road in Burlington. And I told him about the winter. I worked a shutdown at a paper mill in northern Quebec, and couldn't get home for 6 weeks because of weather. And Declan was 9, and my brother drove 4 hours to Sudbury to stay with him. We talked like two men talking, which sounds obvious but wasn't, given everything. He told me carefully that Diane wasn't a bad person, that she'd grown up equating a certain kind of presentation with safety, and that she'd built her whole adult life on that equation, and that she didn't know yet how to separate someone's worth from their surface. She'll come around, he said. She just needs time, and she needs to see that the world doesn't end when her expectations aren't met. I said I understood that, because I did. I've known enough people like Diane to know that the fear underneath the snobbery is almost always older than the snobbery itself. But understanding someone doesn't mean they get to do whatever they want unchallenged. The wedding was May 17th, which that year fell on a Saturday. The venue was a lodge near Collingwood, one of those restored heritage properties, with fieldstone walls and big timber beams and a view of Georgian Bay that made your chest open up when you stepped outside. Beautiful place. The kind of place that costs what it costs and makes no apologies. Declan called me himself 3 weeks before to ask if I'd come. His voice on that call was different from any version of his voice I'd heard in 2 years. Less managed. More like the kid who used to sit at the kitchen table in Sudbury doing his homework while I made dinner. I should have called sooner, Dad. Yes, I said. You should have. I know. I'm sorry. I let other people's discomfort become my responsibility to solve, and I solved it the wrong way. I thought about Sandra then, his mother, and how she would have known exactly what to say to him. Something gentle and precise that would have held him accountable and made him feel loved at the same time. I'm not as good at that as she was. I'm more blunt. You're going to have to figure out who runs your life, I said, because it can't be anybody's mother. Not Diane's and not mine, God rest her. It has to be you and Courtney. He was quiet. Yes, he said finally. I know that. Good. I cleared my throat. I'll be there on the 17th. I bought a new suit. Navy blue, from a proper menswear shop on Elgin Street in Sudbury, where a man named... Well, he'd been in the business 30 years, and he knew what he was doing. He took measurements and adjusted the jacket so it sat right across the shoulders, and picked out a tie that was the exact right shade of gray. I looked at myself in the three-way mirror, and I thought, Sandra would have liked this. She always said I cleaned up better than I gave myself credit for. The morning of the wedding I drove down to Collingwood, 5 hours from Sudbury, more or less. I stopped for coffee in Barrie, at a Tim Hortons on Dunlop Street, the same one Elliot and I had talked about stopping at when we'd said goodbye outside the diner in the fall. Small detail, but it felt right. The ceremony was held in the lodge's main hall, with the doors thrown open to the terrace and the bay beyond. I sat in the third row, not the front. I hadn't asked for that, and it didn't matter to me. Third row was fine. Third row meant I could see my son's face when he turned to watch his bride come down the aisle. And here's the thing I want to say about that moment. The thing I've tried to explain to my brother, and haven't quite managed. When Courtney appeared at the end of the aisle, and the room went the particular kind of quiet that only happens in those seconds, I watched Declan's face. I watched 31 years of raising a human being arrive at this single point. His jaw went slack, and his eyes went bright, and he pressed his lips together the way he used to, when he was a kid trying not to cry at something and thought crying would be embarrassing. He is so much his mother's son in moments like that. So much mine too. I didn't care about Diane. I didn't care about any of it. I was just a father watching his son get married. The reception was in the lodge's great room. Long tables set under the timber beams, candles everywhere. The kind of warmth that a room full of people who love each other generates naturally. I was seated, and this I did not arrange, Elliot did. At the head table adjacent, close enough to matter. Diane sat across the room. I watched her once, when she didn't know I was watching, and I saw the particular expression of a woman who has lost an argument she hadn't finished making yet. Not malicious, just recalibrating. People like Diane always recalibrate. They don't surrender. They find a new position, that's fine. Life is long and positions can change. The moment that I will carry until I am in the ground happened during the speeches. Elliot stood up. He had a glass of champagne, and the room went attentive in the way rooms do when a person has natural authority. He talked about Courtney, her childhood, the things that made her herself, the way she'd changed since meeting Declan. He talked about Declan with a genuine warmth that told me he'd paid attention, that he'd seen my son clearly. And then he set his champagne down and he looked out at the room and he said, I want to say one more thing. About a man I didn't know well enough for too long, and that's on me. He looked at me directly then. The whole room followed his eyes. Gord McCrae raised his son alone after a loss I wouldn't wish on anyone. He worked 31 years with his hands to give Declan every opportunity he could manage. And he did it quietly, without complaint, and without ever making his son feel like a burden or an obligation. That, Elliot said, raising his glass, is what a father looks like, and I am grateful my daughter married into that. The room raised their glasses. I looked down at the table for a moment because I needed to. When I looked up, Declan was watching me from the head table. His eyes were wet. He mouthed something. I couldn't read it exactly, but I'm fairly sure it was "I'm sorry, Dad." I shook my head once, slowly, meaning we're okay, meaning it's done. After dinner, during the dancing, Elliot came and found me at the bar. We stood together for a while, watching our kids on the dance floor, not saying much. He ordered a scotch, I got a Sleeman's, and we clinked our glasses together without making a big thing of it. Good speech, I said. Mean every word. I looked out at Declan, who was laughing at something Courtney had whispered in his ear, and I thought about the kitchen table in Sudbury, the woodpile, the frozen shepherd's pie, the thumbs up emoji. I thought about the letter I'd written to myself and put in the drawer in my bedroom, the one I still haven't reread because I don't need to anymore. Diane found me near the end of the night. I'll give her credit for that. She came to me and she didn't hedge. She said, I handled things poorly. I'm not going to pretend I didn't. Short, direct. I respected the economy of it. I told her I appreciated her saying so. We didn't hug. We didn't need to. Some repairs are long-term projects, and that's all right, as long as the work eventually starts. I drove back to Sudbury the next morning. 5 hours north, the shield opening up around me, the rocks and the lakes and the spruce trees doing what they always do, reminding you that all the human drama that feels enormous down south is pretty small against this much geography. I had the windows down and the radio on, and I was thinking about my wife, about how proud she would have been of him, about how much of who Declan is came from her, and how much came from me, and how the parts that came from me are mostly the parts I'm least proud of, but maybe most grateful for, the stubbornness, the refusal to fold, the willingness to sit with something hard until it becomes manageable. There's a stretch of the 400 north of Barrie, where the highway lifts up onto the ridge, and you get this long view of the terrain rolling north, and on a clear morning, it's one of the better things I've ever seen. I pulled into a rest stop there, and got out, and stood in the cool air for a few minutes, just looking. I hadn't walked my son down any aisle, I hadn't given a speech, I hadn't done any of the things a father is supposed to do at a wedding, in the version of the story I'd imagined when he was small. But I had been there. I had sat in the third row and watched his face, and Elliot Farnsworth, a man I'd met in a diner in Barrie over eggs and bad coffee, had stood up in front of everyone and said my name out loud and meant it. Sometimes that's what it comes down to, not the grand gesture. Just someone willing to say your name in a room where other people might prefer you didn't have one. I got back in the truck and drove north, and the highway stretched out ahead of me, and I turned the radio up, and it was a good morning.